Everyone. Okay, you heard that. Let me start by introducing Professor Cahill to all of you. Professor Cahill, Associate Professor of History at Penn State, is a social historian who explores the everyday experiences of ordinary people, primarily women. Cahill earned her BA from the University of California at Davis and her MA and Ph.D. from the University of Chicago. She focuses on women's working and political lives, asking how identities such as race, nationality, class, and age have shaped them. She is also interested in the connection generated by women's movements for work, play, and politics, and how mapping those movements reveal women in surprising and unexpected places. Professor Cahill is the author of Federal Fathers and Mothers, A Social History of the United States Indian Service, 1869 to 1932, which won the, I hope I pronounced this right, Labriola Center American Indian National Book Award, and was a finalist for the David J. Weber and Bill Clemens Book Prize. Professor Cahill's next project, a project in which she's working on right now, is entitled Indians on the Road, Gender, Race, and Regional Identity Reimagines the West Coast through the lens of Indigenous peoples' relationships with the transportation system that bisected their lands, forming corridors of conquest and environmental change, while simultaneously connecting them in new and sometimes empowering ways to other people and places. Dr. Cahill is the steering committee chair for the Coalition for Western Women's History and served on the National Advisory Committee for the Votes for Women Trail. Welcome, Dr. Cahill. It's all yours.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm really grateful to be here today with you all. It's a gorgeous day here in State College, so I hope it is nice where you are. And as I sit here in State College, I'm on the traditional homeland of the Susquehannock people. And I want to acknowledge that before I get started, especially because I'm going to be talking quite a bit about Native women today. So what I'm going to do is start by sharing my screen. And there you go. Everyone should be able to see that. And there will be a couple slides that are blank, but I'll try to remember to warn you. But for the most part, I like to show a lot of images so folks can get a sense of what I'm talking about. I don't think I have any postcards in here today, but those are really wonderful sources. And I'm really excited to hear you have a collection of them that you'll be looking at. They sometimes included women of color as well, but were mostly white women. But I had a few in my book that I talked about. So this, speaking of my book, this talk is drawn from my book, my second book, Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transform the Suffrage Movement. And I'll give you a bit of an overview today, touch on some of the women I write about there, but it's generally a collective biography of 6 women of color, 3 Indigenous women, an African-American woman who was a poet and an activist, named Carrie Williams Clifford. I'm not talking about her today. A Chinese woman that you'll meet, and a woman who called herself Hispana or Hispanic from New Mexico, whom I'll also talk about today. So one of the first things that when I started thinking about this presentation, I thought, well, what will people think of when they hear the word suffrage or suffragist? And so I thought, well, what if we Google it, right? What is the image that comes up? And if you Google it, it looks pretty much like this. And as you can see, most of them are photographs, which tells us something about when they started being taken, but also that most of the pictures here, in fact, I think all of them are white women. Now, Google is obviously not a perfect snapshot of the world, but it does give you a good sense of what people are usually looking for and what they click on, right? And so it's telling that these are mostly white women, but it's not surprising. It doesn't surprise me. Most of what people know about suffrage history tends to be about white women, right? We know some of the big names: Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. And most people think of it as a movement full of white women. Sometimes, and you don't see it here, but sometimes there's a tab at the top for sort of other searches, and sometimes it'll say African-American women. So they're there, but then they're sometimes separated out. And again, there were, of all the women involved, the largest number were white women. So in some sense, this makes sense. But what we miss if we don't talk about other women is the sense of diversity in the movement. And when we think even beyond sort of the Black and white dichotomy that sometimes does get discussed, we see that there are women from many other groups participating in the suffrage movement. And when we put their stories into the mix and ask what happens when we think about how those groups interacted and what similarities they had and what differences they had as they were fighting for suffrage. And I think this is really important. Right now, we are in a moment of really exciting set of kind of firsts, right? On March 18th, Deb Haaland was sworn in as the first Native woman to be Secretary of the Interior. Haaland was already an important first. She was one of the first 2 Native women elected to Congress in 2018. And of course, she was sworn in by Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the first woman to serve as vice president, the first African-American, and the first person of Asian descent, right? And so all of these firsts kind of coming together. And if you watched Haaland's Senate hearings, you saw that she was questioned by Senator Cortez Masto, who's the first Latina in the Senate. So right here in 2021, all of these firsts for women of color are happening. And that's exciting, but what I hope to convince you of is there's a really long history of this, right? They didn't just come out of thin air, but this has been over 100 years in the making. So the one other thing I want to mention before I really dive into this is I'm going to talk a lot about race today. And race isn't a biological reality, but during the time that I'm discussing today, most Americans did believe that race was real, and they used that belief to structure their world. So the women that I'm going to talk about today encountered that belief on a daily basis through the laws, through popular culture, through social customs, all of which that were constructed around the idea that racial difference was real and that it mattered. And as a result, right, that past shaped our present. So the race mattered then, and as a result of its legacies, it matters to us now. So we have to talk about it to understand this world that we now live in, that we've inherited, right? So we can move on. So blank screen, it's okay. What I'm going to do today in the talk is take sort of 3 moments that are actually pretty famous suffrage moments in the history of women's suffrage, and that are key in the fight, particularly for the 19th Amendment, which is the women's suffrage amendment, right? And I'm going to show them to you from slightly different angles. And I'm going to argue that when we include women from these different groups, it changes our understanding of the history of suffrage. And it does so in 3 ways. First, it expands our knowledge and understanding of the many communities that were having conversations about suffrage and voting rights and how those conversations influenced each other. Secondly, it encourages us to think about women of color not as just an undifferentiated group, as you'll see, but a group, again, that had some things in common, but also many differences. And I'll kind of point some of these out as I go. And finally, while this project adds new suffrage stories to our history, it isn't just additive, right? We don't just kind of add more. It actually changes our story, right? And it shows us that the presence and participation of women of color influenced national and sometimes transnational dialogue about suffrage and women's rights in ways that we haven't always understood. So if we incorporate those stories, we're forced to reconsider our old turning points and add some new ones. And also, in particular, I'll show that 1920 and the passage of the 19th Amendment were incredibly important, but they didn't hold the same importance for all women. And that's something that we have to consider when we tell these stories. So the three kind of moments I'm going to look at are the 1912 New York City Suffrage Parade, which was kind of the first major suffrage parade in the country. The 1913 Washington, D.C. Suffrage Parade, which was the first, when suffragists sort of announced that they were going to refocus on the passage of a constitutional amendment. And then I'm going to focus on the ratification of that amendment in 1920 and sort of what kind of happens after that. But first, I'm going to introduce you to some of the women I'm talking about. So in 1901, 5-year-old Mabel Pinghua Lee sailed from China with her mother. They arrived in San Francisco, where they were greeted by her father, Li Thew, who was a Baptist minister. And although Chinese immigration had been outlawed, essentially, or extremely restricted by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, because Mabel's mother was a teacher, she was admitted into the country under one of the very few exceptions for Chinese immigrants. And so she and Mabel come to join her father, Mabel's father, but also because of the Chinese exclusion law, they were not born in the United States and therefore were unable to naturalize. So the Chinese exclusion law restricted immigration from China and said that anyone who did make it through could not become a naturalized citizen. The second woman I'm going to talk about is Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin. She was very proud of both her French and her Ojibwe heritages. She would have called herself Chippewa, but now the nation uses Ojibwe. She'd moved from Minnesota to Washington, D.C. around 1890, and she moved with her father, who was the attorney for the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Nation. He was coming to Washington, D.C. to basically fight for treaty rights for the nation, and she came to work as his legal clerk. They basically were insisting that a treaty the United States had forced them to sign in 1882 had not paid them enough for their land. They were arguing it was worth more than 10 cents an acre, and they wanted the government to adjust that. And so he brings his daughter to work for him. The third person that I'll talk about, you may have heard of, Ida B. Wells, eventually Ida B. Wells Barnett. She was no stranger to life's challenges. Her parents and her youngest brother had died of yellow fever within a day of each other in Mississippi, leaving 16-year-old Ida to raise her 5 other siblings. She worked as a teacher 6 miles from her home in order to try to support her family. And later she moved to take a teaching job in Memphis, Tennessee. And in that city, she also began to work for a local African-American newspaper. And in 1892, she wrote this piece that was a scathing critique of lynching, and she implicated her white neighbors in Memphis for supporting the practice. And this is how she described the reaction to that editorial. Quote, "I had a price put on my head and had been made an exile from home for hinting at the truth." And essentially, she's run out of town and she moves to Chicago, Illinois. This is Adelina Isabella Amelia Luna Otero-Warren, or Nina. And she was the daughter of 2 extremely politically influential Hispanic families in New Mexico. During her lifetime, the Anglo population, or the white population in New Mexico territory, had begun to dramatically increase because of the railroads. But Spanish speakers still held a great deal of political power. And her family was quite involved in territorial politics. So for example, her cousin, Miguel Otero, had been appointed territorial governor by President McKinley in 1897. And though her sex kept her from these political heights, she was very interested in them and sort of joining that family tradition. So those are some of the women I'm going to focus on. And then let me just give you a little bit of context from the moment that I'm going to start this story. So really right around the turn of the 20th century. So suffrage leaders had suffrage leaders were following a strategy kind of after the 1870s of focusing on winning women's suffrage in a state by state fashion, right? So working at the state level to win suffrage for women in those states. And you can see in this political cartoon, the states in white are the states that have successfully passed full women's suffrage legislation. And you can see they're all Western states, right? And this starts with Wyoming Territory in 1869, but expands really dramatically at the turn of the century. So California in 1911, Oregon in 1912, Arizona in 1912. The states that are kind of gray are states that had partial women's suffrage. So women could often vote in elections that had to do with school. So school board or school superintendent. And you can see a lot of the Midwestern states are like that. And then black is places where there's no women's suffrage at all, right? So New Mexico, you can sort of see it's sort of under the female figure's arm. New Mexico is gray. So New Mexico becomes a state in 1912. And during the Constitutional Convention, they had debated whether or not they should have full women's suffrage like other Western states. But ultimately, the men writing the state Constitutional Convention only included school suffrage. I'll also talk a little bit later about that constitution and why it was so hard to change, but we'll come back to that. But so turn of the century right here, the strategy for suffragists is really to work within their own states. And that had been successful, again, primarily in the American West. All right, so now I'm gonna go to my first story here, right? So we're gonna move to New York in 1912. And if you want this song stuck in your head, the tune of this is My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean, right? So New York State had the largest congressional delegation in the country in 1912. And suffrage leaders hoped that if they could win suffrage in New York State, right, that would get them closer to having a majority of pro-suffrage congressmen in Congress, right? And they could then ultimately maybe pass national legislation. So in May of 1912, they were planning a massive parade in New York City to publicize this cause. Now, at the same time, as you can see from this song, events were happening in China that suffragists in the United States were watching quite closely. So the events of the Chinese Revolution of 1911 and 1912 are really complex. And I can't really go into them in detail here. I will say, this is not the Communist Revolution, that's in 1949. This was the Republican Revolution that overthrew the Qing dynasty and established the Republic of China. And it's led by Sun Yat-sen. And in his vision for a Republican China, he emphasized women's equality and women's rights, and women took part in the cause. And you can see from these newspaper articles in the United States that again, there was great interest and people were following this story. And sorry, live captioning is now on, so I'm gonna just tuck that away. So he's emphasizing rights for women. People in the United States are seeing stories in newspapers that are about how women were participating in the revolution, right? Fighting in this all-female unit, carrying bombs, serving as spies. And upon the success of the revolution and the provisional government, news came to the United States that, as you can see here, China had granted women the right to vote. So many suffrage supporters in the United States felt, quote, glad but irritated too by this news. And they saw it as a, quote, discredit to the men of this country, of the United States, that China had enfranchised its women before the US. And indeed, if we think about those exclusion acts, right, Americans held China and the Chinese people in very low regard. They're the only group of people in the world who face those kinds of immigration restrictions. They're seen as too foreign to become US citizens. And in terms of thinking about Chinese women in the United States, almost all of them were stereotyped as sex workers, as prostitutes, in part, right, because most of the Chinese population were in places like California with the history of the gold rush. So news that Chinese women had been enfranchised didn't match these stereotypes about the Chinese in the United States and really confuses Americans. So American reporters, of course, find that this story is selling. So they go digging for more stories in their own backyards. And what they found were a number of Chinese women in American cities who are happy to talk to them about their support of women's rights and what's happening in China. And these Chinese women and Chinese American women used these moments to suggest to white Americans that their ideas about the Chinese as very backwards might be wrong, right? And their ideas about China as a backward nation was wrong, right? And here are just two pictures from some of these meetings. The left is in New York City and the right is in Portland, Oregon. There was a meeting in Cincinnati, Ohio. In Boston, Massachusetts, a young college girl, I think from Wellesley, comes to speak to a group of white suffragists. And so you can see these Chinese and Chinese American women were participating in these conversations. So in the New York City picture, this included white suffragists who are major leaders in the movement. So the woman at the podium is the Reverend Dr. Anna Howard Shaw. She at the time was the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NASA, which is the main national organization. And she and the other white suffragists know that if they have this meeting and they invite Chinese women, it's going to be covered by the press, and indeed it is. So they're there to kind of, raise this, get public interest. And the Chinese suffragists at this meeting, on the far left with the two children is a woman named Pearl Liu. On the far right, the woman sitting is Li Liebeck, and kind of over her shoulder is her daughter, Mabel Li. They come because they had a lot to say. And this interest in the Chinese Revolution gives them a platform. They're invited to talk, so they're going to go and say what they have to say. And they're able to address some of the most powerful women in the nation, right? Anna Howard Shaw. So they're a well-educated group of Christian women. Their husbands were leaders in Chinatown. They all had ties to missionary movements in China. And in fact, both of the older women had worked for the Graves Mission Station in Canton as teachers before coming here. They were all immigrants in the era of Chinese exclusion. And so this is a picture of the census for Mabel Li's family. And you can see there that their status is alien, right? So they're not able to naturalize. They will always be outsiders. But despite that, they had done work in Chinatown. They were part of an organization called the Chinese Women's Club for Mutual Encouragement. They worked with the YWCA, and their activism addressed the problems faced by their community. They raised money for famine victims in China, but they also addressed the harsh immigration laws and the lack of educational opportunities for Chinese and Chinese Americans in the United States. So when they get up to speak, they sort of shared some of these issues with their audience. So this is, you can see Mabel Li speaking here. She's standing in front of the crowd. But first, Pearl Liu spoke, and she was famous because she had been detained in San Francisco when she first immigrated for not having her papers in order. She was also a teacher, so she was one of these exceptions, but she had been detained for over a month, and it became kind of an international incident. And she gave a talk once she was finally released to a church group in San Francisco, where she talked about her experiences as well as her work in the women's suffrage movement in China. Now, I don't know what she said in New York, but I imagine it was a very similar kind of speech, right? So touching on those same themes. Mabel Li, who you see here, was a high school student at the time. She's only 16, but she's incredibly impressive. She had been accepted to Barnard College, where she would attend in the fall, and she was already quite a speaker. Later, newspapers would describe her as very charismatic, as Mabelizing the crowds that she spoke to. And she talked especially about educational opportunities, something that was close to her heart. And she said that this burden was especially hard on girls, that there weren't enough schools for Chinese children. And she said, all women are recognized in New York, excepting Chinese women. She is not included in your educational institutions. Your social and recreational centers do not include her. How can she learn? How can you have half of your people in utter darkness and the other half in light? So she's very proud that her country, China, had enfranchised women, but she lived in New York and she hoped that New Yorkers would recognize the importance of equality, both gender equality, but also racial equality. So she impresses the suffrage leaders with her talk, and they invite her to participate in their upcoming parade that they were planning. And they don't just invite her to be in it, they actually ask her to ride at the head of the parade with a group of about 50 other equestrian women who open it and who lead the parade up Fifth Avenue. And as you can see here, she does. And this gets a lot of attention, and her picture circulates across the country in newspapers like the Washington Post here. And so she becomes really kind of a known quantity because of this. The other women from Chinatown, including her mother and Mrs. Liu, also participated in a different section. They marched, they carry the flags of the new Republic of China. They also carried banners that said things like, "Light from China." They're very aware that Americans often talked about benighted China, right? This was the reason Americans needed to send missionaries there. And so they're flipping the script, right? They're throwing these kind of terms back to Americans that China's enlightened and you are benighted. Now, suffragists, when they held these parades, which they did quite a bit, it was a big suffrage strategy, nothing is left to chance. Everything is carefully choreographed. And that was the case here too. So the women from Chinatown were marching, and directly behind them marched the Reverend Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, the president of NASA. And she carried this flag, which said NASA, catching up with China. So she too is using this surprise about China's modern move to send a message. And the message is that it's challenging white American men to catch up with China, right? Suggesting that they should be embarrassed by this role reversal and they need to fix the problem by enfranchising white women, right? So it puts China in the enlightened position and the United States in the backwards position. So again, the press is very interested in Chinese women. White suffragists are obviously paying close attention to them. And this stands in really sharp contrast to Black women who were also in this parade. So African-American women in the New York City, the New York State movement are important because Black men in New York can vote. So white suffragists, as Rosalind Terborg Penn has argued, knew that they had to make overtures to Black women and include them in order to win more votes, right, to win Black men's support. So they ask Black women to be in the parade, and African-American women agree, but they also deploy symbolism. So for example, parade organizers had said all women should wear white dresses and these white hats for the parade. Well, the Black suffragists chose to wear Black dresses with yellow votes for women sashes, and reversing that, right? And Black women were treated very differently, as I said, by the reporters. So while there was lots of discussion and pictures and the names of the Chinese women in the newspapers, Black women were virtually ignored by reporters. A few of them mentioned that they were there, but they lumped them all together as nameless, quote, negresses. And the New York Times only said that their leader was a great fighter, but they didn't name her. It was probably Mrs. I.L. Moorman, who was the head of the colored branch of the Political Equity Association. So really different experiences. Over the next few months, white suffrage leaders sort of kept the spotlight on Chinese women. Anna Howard Shaw took this banner on a speaking tour around the country over the summer, and again, challenging white Americans to remember that China was ahead of them. In September, Carrie Chapman Catt, who at the time was the president of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance, and she'd go on to become president of NASA, she was on a world tour and she visited China. And in Canton, she went to the Guangdong Provisional Assembly and she saw women who had been elected to that assembly and watched them legislating. And she said later in an article, it was the most wonderful day of her life so far, right? To see women actually governing and in action. And again, she's writing about it for American audiences. You see another one of her articles here. So now, unfortunately, China's revolution soon descended into civil war as different factions struggled for power. The faction that supported women's equality, Dr. Sun Yat-sen and his allies, lost the upper hand, and the story of suffrage in China would take much longer to come to fulfillment. But in the US, after this sort of year of focus on it, most white suffragists moved on to other things. But Chinese women and Chinese American women continued to follow these stories. And Mabel Lee enrolled at Barnard College and continued, again, to be involved. And in fact, white suffrage leaders would periodically ask her to come speak and kind of give them an update on China. But her career after 1912 also shows us the transnational or international nature of her activism. So at Barnard, she joined something called the Chinese Student Alliance. So essentially, there was a major exchange student program where Chinese students would come to the United States, go to college, and then go back to China. So they're not immigrants, they're students. It was called the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship Fund. And until 1918, they were all men. So many colleges and universities had sort of groups of Chinese students, and they created this organization called the Chinese Student Alliance. It's a national group. And Mabel becomes a member of it, and in fact is elected as an officer of that organization. Most of the students from China were going to go back and be future political and business leaders. So they were going to build the new Republic of China. And so Mabel speaks directly to them about the importance of including and continuing to include women's rights in the new nation. Right? So you can see she wrote articles for the Chinese Students Monthly, which was the journal of this organization. And she makes these arguments about how, as they build the new nation, right, women's rights should absolutely be connected to it. In 1917, she was nominated for president of the Chinese Student Alliance, and she runs in an election. She loses by 1 vote. So 1917, she's running for president. 1917 is also an important date in suffrage history. That's the year that women win the right to vote in New York State. And so while Mabel she could participate in the Chinese Student Alliance elections, she could not vote in US elections because she was not a citizen. So despite that, she continues to live her feminism. In one of her articles, she had argued that there were many ways women were advancing, that the vote was only one part of feminism, that there were many other aspects. And she pointed out that one place that women needed to challenge was their place in the professions. And that's where she decided to kind of put her energy. She decided to go into a Ph.D. program at Columbia University and get her degree in economics. She does this, she graduates in 1921, and she's one of the very few women in the United States to get a degree in that field. And as far as I can tell, the only Chinese or Chinese American woman in the US to do so. So she had long hoped to return to China, again, to build this new nation. But her father's death in 1924 and the unrest in China stymied her plans. And so instead, she turned to helping her community in New York. Her father had founded the first Chinese Baptist Church of New York City, which is still there, still a working congregation. And when he passed away, she took over the administration of that church. And she held that position until her death in 1966. So Maple Lee's suffrage story deserves to be known in its own right, because she's a phenomenal woman who constantly strove to demonstrate that women could be equal to men. She challenged multiple limits, and she worked to help her community. But her participation in the suffrage movement also opens up a new vista on a familiar story. We see that white American suffragists were very interested in events in China and followed them closely. When Chinese women won the right to vote, it gave American women a new strategy in their fight, and they took full advantage of it. It also opened up a space for Chinese women in the United States, giving them a large national audience to whom they could make their case for gender and racial equality. And her story also, again, reminds us of the transnational nature of the suffrage movement, that she was interested in suffrage and women's rights in the United States, but also in China. So I'm going to move away from Maple Lee in New York and go on to my second moment. And that will take us to a little bit further south in Washington, D.C. So in Washington, another woman was becoming an important first. As you recall, Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin had moved to the nation's capital to fight with her father for the Turtle Mountain Chippewa Nation's treaty rights. By 1904, Congress had settled the treaty on its original terms, so they don't get any more money. And this action leads Marie and her father into a lawsuit. And their lawyer was none other than the famous Belva Lockwood. Now, you may have heard of Belva Lockwood. She was a former presidential candidate and the first woman admitted to the bar of the Supreme Court. So she's a big feminist and suffragist herself. And I suspect that meeting Lockwood opened up Marie Baldwin's horizons. Here was a female lawyer, not just a law clerk. And Belva Lockwood was also on the board of a law school, the Washington College of Law, that was founded by feminist lawyers to train other women in law, because most law schools rejected women because of their sex. So a few years after the trial, Marie Baldwin enrolled at the Washington College of Law. And not surprisingly, this school is a hotbed of women's suffrage activity, right? And I should note that while the founders of the Washington College of Law were adamant about sex equality, they were less so about racial equality. And again, this is complicated. So they claim to be the only law school for men and women in the city. But in fact, Howard University, the historically Black university that had been founded during Reconstruction for African Americans, Howard allowed women to enroll in its law school. And the founders of the Washington College of Law knew this because one of them had taken classes there. But they refused to allow African Americans to enroll at their school. As a Native woman, though, Marie Baldwin was viewed differently. She did not face that level of discrimination, and she was allowed to enroll. And you can see here in the newspaper that she doesn't hide that she's a Native woman, right? She celebrates that she is of Chippewa or Ojibwe descent. She's a really impressive student. She was 42 years old when she enrolled in law school, so kind of a mid-life career change. But the fact that she was her father's law clerk helped her move through classes very quickly. But she was also working full-time for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And she was very active in a new group called the Society of American Indians. Much like the NAACP, the Society of American Indians wanted to disabuse Americans of their stereotypes about Native people. And one of the stereotypes that they really were fighting against was the idea that Indians were in the past, that they were primitive, and not modern, and were disappearing because the modern world was just too overwhelming for them. And Marie Baldwin and many of her colleagues in the Society of American Indians were extremely accomplished, right? She's got her law degree. She's working for the government. She's very similar to other members of the organization. And they argued that this was false, right? That Native people had a future, that they could be very modern. They could be, in the parlance of the time, quote unquote, civilized. She also emphasized women's rights, right? And one of the things that Native people pointed out was that in many traditional cultures, Native women had more rights than white women did. And so she's here, right? She says Native women were the first suffragists and had a say in their tribal governments. So her time at the Washington College of Law and in the Society of American Indians gets her very involved in the political conversations around suffrage, and she urges women's equality. In this article, she says all women should get their law degrees, but especially Native women who need to protect their property, their land, right? Okay, so let's step back for just a minute to the bigger context of what's happening in the suffrage movement. I mentioned earlier that the fight had been going, right, on a state-by-state basis. Well, in 1913, some suffragists were starting to argue that that was too slow, right? To get every state was going to take forever, and perhaps they needed to focus on a constitutional amendment that would change the law for all states immediately. And a young Alice Paul was a rising star in the movement, and she took this up as her challenge. And she began to plan another parade that would announce this new strategy to the nation. She decides to hold this parade in March in 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. This is very strategic. She knows that an enormous number of people will be in the Capitol for the inauguration. She knows they will all be bored the day before, and that all of the reporters that will be there would be interested in reporting on such an event. Because of her activism in Washington, Marie Baldwin was asked to participate in this parade. She is asked actually to create a float showing the matriarchal power of traditional Native cultures. And there's some language on this slide that is no longer, right, respectable with some, so we're gonna just the word squaw is not an okay word. It carried sexual overtones, but it's from 1913, right? So she was asked to create this float that would celebrate this traditional power Native women had. And you can see that white suffragists were really interested in this as well. It was kind of similar to the reasons they were interested in women in China. But she's pretty busy in 1913 in law school and working. But she also, again, wanted to emphasize the Native people could be modern, right? She's pushing back against those stereotypes. So she doesn't create a float. She decides instead to march with the other lawyers in Washington, D.C. So she participates in the parade. And again, the parade planners treated her as a Native woman very differently than they treated the African-American suffragists who also wanted to participate in this parade. Alice Paul and many white suffragists were very worried that they would lose the support of white Southern politicians if they included African-American women in their suffrage movement. And they were not wrong. I'm going to show you a pretty disturbing card, an anti-suffrage card from Georgia from 1916. And you'll see that for Southern whites, the idea of discussions about voting rights was not something that they wanted to happen because they were worried it would bring up the fact that Southerners had essentially disenfranchised Black men through the Jim Crow laws, right? And you can see from the very bottom line there, they're against women's suffrage because white supremacy must be maintained. So they believed that women's suffrage would enfranchise Black women, but would also kind of reopen the question of Black men voting as well. And so they were very against it. And white suffragists believed, again, that if they segregated the movement, that they could win over Southern politicians to their cause. They were not able to. This was not something that happened, but they kept trying. So Alice Paul does not want Black women to participate. And she wrote to a friend, "As far as I can see, we must have a white procession or a Negro procession or no procession at all." And when Black women asked to have a place in the parade, at first she said no. And they said, "Well, we're going to come." And then she said, "Fine, but you'll need to march in the back." And they said, "No, that's not acceptable either." And many of them insisted on marching in the parade in the places that they wanted to be. But this was muddled, right? There was a lot of confusion around this. And what happens is that some Black women were really discouraged from marching. And I'm going to talk a little bit here about Ida B. Wells, who I mentioned earlier. So the anti-lynching activist who had been run out of Memphis and moved to Chicago, Illinois, where she had helped found the first African-American suffrage club in the state. It was called the Alpha Suffrage Club. And when the women of Illinois sent delegates to Washington to this parade, Ida B. Wells was included in the number. And when the Illinois women got to Washington, they heard that the parade was going to be segregated, that Black women would have to march in the back. And so they took a vote. Should they allow their colleague, Ida B. Wells, to march with her state delegation, or would she have to march with the women of her race in the back? And there was a very intense meeting and sort of arguments about it, but she's the only Black woman in the group. And ultimately, a majority of the Illinois delegates voted that she should have to march in the back of the parade. So on the morning of the parade, she didn't appear as they all gathered in their place, and they assumed she was at the end. But as they began marching, she steps out of the crowd and into her rightful place with the Illinois delegation. And you can see here is a photo of her from the Chicago Tribune. And she's basically daring people to cause a public scene and kick her out. And she said later, "I didn't do this for myself." She says, quote, "I did it for the future benefit of my whole race," right? This insistence on equality and being, right, marching where she felt she needed to march. And again, the parade was not actually segregated, so there was some miscommunication. And the other, many women, a number of Black women marched in different groups of professions. Carrie Williams Clifford, the poet I mentioned that I write about, marched with the housekeepers. There's also a large group of college women from Howard University who were members of the Suffrage Club, Delta Sigma Theta sorority. And it was their first public appearance as a sorority. And they felt it was important to march in the suffrage parade as their first public act. So again, it's important to think about the different ways women from different groups were treated, right? Marie Baldwin was invited to participate and create a float. Black women were very much discouraged and have to kind of insist that they will be there. So Ida B. Wells finishes the parade with her state, and a few months later, Illinois passed partial women's suffrage legislation. Women could vote for president and for in the school elections. So she was thrilled, but she also was aware that women from her home state of Tennessee were still unable to vote at all, and that their community continued to be plagued by Jim Crow laws and the violence of lynching. So historians of suffrage have acknowledged African-American women's participation in the movement. And indeed, I draw this story of Ida B. Wells from other historians, especially African-American scholars. But they weren't the only women of color to participate, right? Like much of American history, when we talk about diversity, we talk about Black women. And that's really important. And that's a very important first step. And as we've seen, they are often treated differently from other women of color. But it doesn't reflect sort of the multicultural diversity of America. And if we look at how Native women were treated differently by white suffragists than African-American women, we can see that not all women of color had these same experiences. Catherine, I'll come back to whether Baldwin can vote. That's actually what I'm going to talk about next. That's a really good question, if she could vote in 1920. So for all of these women, you know, different parts of their identity mattered. Race, obviously, and sex, but also their class. All of these women were fairly elite women in their communities. Citizenship, as we've seen, really matters. So we have to think about all of those things as we're comparing their experiences. And again, there are some similarities, particularly the kinds of stereotypes that they confront. But in other places, their experiences are quite different. But what we certainly see is this question of race is central to debates around suffrage. So now I'm going to get to Catherine's question about if Marie Baldwin, and by extension, I think Native women more broadly, could vote in 1920. And that will take us to our third moment. So again, 1920 is really this moment that that we focus on, right? The ratification of the 19th Amendment, often known as the Women's Suffrage Amendment. But what the 19th Amendment actually says is the vote shall not be denied on the basis of sex, not women have the right to vote, right? Those are two different things. And we'll come back to that. So 6 years after that parade in Washington, it was Ida B. Wells's home state of Tennessee where one of the most dramatic chapters of suffrage, the suffrage struggle, took place. So by 1920, Congress had passed the amendment that happens in 1919 and sent it out to the states to be ratified. And it needed 3/4 of all of the 48 states. So it needed 36 states to ratify it to become a part of the Constitution. And by March of 1920, 35 states had ratified. This is just one shy of what they called the perfect 36. And throughout the spring and summer, it was essentially mostly Southern states that were left, and many of them rejected the amendment, right? So disappointment upon disappointment for suffragists. And by August, it came down to Tennessee, where the governor had called a special legislative session to consider the amendment. Both pro and anti forces come to Nashville to lobby. And Carrie Chapman Catt, whom you see here, who was now the president of Nassau, coordinates the campaign from her hotel room in the Hermitage Hotel. And she kind of lets local Tennessee suffragists do the lobbying, right? She knows she's an outsider, so she's really kind of behind the scenes. But she keeps a running list of the legislators who are likely to vote for it and those who would vote against it, right? She's really kind of monitoring every detail. It passes the state Senate pretty handily, and then it comes down to the House, right? And this is a struggle that women have been exerting energy for decades, right? From before the Civil War to this moment, women had been fighting for the right to vote. And this vote, right, to ratify the amendment came down to a single House and ultimately was passed by a single vote, right? One single vote from a first-term legislature who had actually been down on Catt's list as against the vote, but he changes his mind. And the story goes, it's partly because his mother sent him a note that said, help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification, right? So Harry Burns puts in a pro vote. And so Tennessee ratifies and it becomes part of the Constitution. Carrie Chapman Catt returns to New York here in triumph, and this impromptu parade carries her from the train station to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, where there's a major celebratory banquet. She's given this bouquet of flowers, there are bands, and she triumphantly announces at that banquet, quote, "Now that we have the vote, let us remember we are no longer petitioners, but we are wards. We are no longer wards of the government, but free and equal citizens. Let us do our part to keep it a true and triumphant democracy." And she added, "The victory was everybody's victory who had labored in the cause." But it wasn't quite true. Not everybody who labored in the cause was able to vote in 1920. So what I'm going to do quickly is look at the state of New Mexico, and we can see how the different experiences of women suggest that, right, 1920 was different for different groups. So I mentioned the Constitution of New Mexico, right? And I had mentioned Nina Otero-Warren. So when New Mexicans wrote their constitution in 1912, Congress had actually stipulated that it needed to be an English-only constitution. And many of the men writing that constitution were bilingual or Spanish speakers, and they refused this. And so they made the New Mexico Constitution, they wrote in a protection for language rights for Spanish language. They also wrote in protection of religious rights, especially for the Catholic religion, of which many of them were, and again, which was a religion that was very much frowned upon by most of the rest of the nation. And as a result, they made the Constitution, the stipulations about who could vote in the Constitution, very difficult to amend, almost impossible, because they wanted to protect language and religious rights. And because despite being lobbied by women like Nina Otero-Warren, they had not included full women's suffrage, right? New Mexico women faced a giant obstacle in changing the Constitution at the state level. And so that strategy wasn't going to work for them. So when Alice Paul begins to work for a national amendment, that's something that New Mexico women are excited about. And in New Mexico, the Alice Paul's organization, which becomes known as the National Women's Party, knows and recognizes the power, the political power of Spanish-speaking women, that they have to include them in suffrage activities, or there's no way that this will be supported by the majority of the population, which is Spanish-speaking. So the National Women's Party is very open to women like Nina Otero-Warren, who joins and ultimately becomes the state chair for the National National Women's Party. And they insist, people like Warren and other women like Aurora Lucero insist that, right, suffrage has to be bilingual in New Mexico. And they print suffrage literature in Spanish. They often have both English and Spanish speakers at their events, and women from the Spanish-speaking community are very involved. So New Mexico became the 32nd state to ratify the amendment. And Nina Otero-Warren played a really pivotal role in that ratification. It looked, initially, everyone thought it would go very smoothly. At the very last minute, there were some legislators who balked, and she was literally down on the floor whipping up votes. And she's one of the reasons that the state ratifies it. So after women win full suffrage because of the constitutional amendment in New Mexico, Spanish-speaking women are able to vote right away. They win the right to vote. And the political parties in New Mexico recognize this and nominate women for public office. So Nina Otero-Warren is nominated by the Republican Party to run as their congressional candidate in 1922. And you can see here, this gets national media attention. She's one of the first women in the nation to run for Congress after the passage of the amendment, and certainly the first woman of color nominated by a major political party, and the first Latina. She uses those skills that she'd honed as a suffrage campaigner in her congressional campaign. However, it was a very bad year for the Republicans in New Mexico that year, and she loses. But as I mentioned, both parties nominated women. And the Democrats nominated Soledad Chavez de Chacon, who you see in the very upper right. She ran for Secretary of State, and she won. And she was the first woman in the nation to hold that office, and she's the first Latina to hold that office. Right? So in New Mexico, Spanish-speaking women very quickly move into the party structures and, again, are running for office. And New Mexico elects a number of women to their state legislature in the following years. Right? But this, despite this, not all women in New Mexico had the same experience. Anglo and Hispanic women do. Native women have a very different experience. And this is sort of more broadly applicable to Native women throughout the country. They were not included in the expansion of the franchise because many Native people, at least a third of all adults and possibly more, were not considered citizens. They were legally wards of the government, right? So legal wards have no control over their monies, their bank accounts, their land, and they certainly can't participate in politics. And this was something that the activists in the Society of American Indians had been pointing out for some time, right? That the Native people were not citizens, and even those who legally might have been, it was often extremely confusing to know if you were. Excuse me. So the Society of American Indians continues to make this case after 1920. And a colleague of Marie Baldwin's in that group, Gertrude Bonnen, or Zitkalasa, was one of the women who continues to make the case that Native people deserve citizenship and voting rights. She was already famous because she was an author and people knew her work. And in 1921, she addresses the National Women's Party at a major conference that they hold in February of 1921. And she congratulates white women on their winning the right to vote, but she reminds them that Native women and Native men still can't vote. And she often pointed to the fact that Native men who'd served in World War I, who were veterans, had fought for the country and were still not considered citizens and could not vote, right? So she's not just fighting for Native women's right to vote, but Native men's as well. And I just want to point out very quickly that, once again, Black women were there, but had to fight to be there. They had to actually threaten Alice Paul that they would picket the conference if she didn't let them talk. And they wanted to tell the gathered women, white women, that while Black women in the North were able to vote after 1920, in the South, they were disenfranchised by those same Jim Crow laws that kept Black men from voting, and that the suffrage fight wasn't over, right? And you also see that, once again, a representative of China was at this conference. So Gertrude Bonnen continues to bring this message to other women, white women across the country, especially the oh my goodness, went right out of my head. The General Federation of Women's Clubs. I'm almost done. I'm gonna wrap this up in a second. So she speaks to them. And this is a talk she gave in this time, Americanize the First Americans, right? Kind of pointing out this irony that the indigenous people of the United States on the whole could not vote and were not citizens. And in 1924, partly as a result of her activism, Congress passes the Indian Citizenship Act, which grants US citizenship to all Native peoples, right? So they all have it. Not all Native people wanted it, and that's a different story, but Gertrude Bonnen really celebrates this as an opportunity. And she believes that Native people, particularly in states with large Native populations, so many Western states, can use the vote to advocate for their communities, right? To protect tribal land, to argue for tribal sovereignty, right? And to run their own communities in ways that they hadn't been able to because they were considered federal wards. So she forms an organization called another organization called the National Council of American Indians, and begins to travel to different communities, encouraging Native people to register to vote and participate. And as I said, she's very optimistic about this. You can see that white Americans were also interested and sometimes more concerned about this new Native voting population. And these are from elections during the 1920s. And you can see, right, how Native people are going to vote is a hot issue that newspapers are covering. And in 1928, it seems like things look really bright for Native people, right? The Republican candidate for Herbert Hoover, for his vice president, was Senator Charles Curtis, who, I'm almost done, who was Native American. And he described himself as 1/8 Kaw Indian and 100% Republican. And he was widely known as a supporter of women's rights and had actually introduced the ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, in Congress for the first time. He becomes the first vice president of color, but at precisely the same time, in many of those Western states, state legislatures began to shut down voting rights and disenfranchise Native people. So in Arizona and New Mexico, state courts ruled that if you lived on a reservation, you still couldn't vote despite being a US citizen. In places like Montana, they dropped voters from the registration rolls, required that they re-register, but moved any registration offices very far from reservation districts, right? So really, despite that initial optimism of the 1920s, most Native people in Western states are disenfranchised using similar tactics as Southern states and Jim Crow laws. And that won't change until after World War II, when veterans sue for voting rights, and then especially with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So I'll go ahead and end there and hope that what I've shown has been that, again, women of color are absolutely part of this conversation about voting rights, and that 1920 is incredibly important, but not for all women. So I know there are already some questions, and I am happy to take them.
I have some for you.
Great. I'm glad to hear it, Will.
We've got about 20 minutes left. If you have any other additional questions, please put them in the chat. Let me go here. Okay.
Will, please turn your video on.
I can't. I tried, but somebody's controlling it.
Oh, then I will turn you on.
Okay. Thank you, Kate.
Okay.
Kathleen, early on you mentioned race.
Mm-hmm.
And we know race, for many people, race is a social construct as opposed to having a biological basis. Would you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's exactly it, right? It matters because it is this social construct, and it has been built into our laws and into kind of all sorts of things. But I was just trying to point out that I don't think it's biologically a real thing, but it is something we have to talk about and take seriously because people in the past really believed that it was. And so, right, a lot of these, again, I think law is a good place to look, but also, movies and old books and all of these things that included it really structure the way we think about it today. So that legacy, right, of the past is still around. And so, right, these, talking about these women by their racial categories, partly I have to do that because that's how people at the time thought of them, right? And really those categories constrained them in certain ways, and they had to work around them.
Thank you. Would you say something about the negative narrative in the West about China as a country and Chinese women?
Yeah, absolutely. So, really starting around the time of the gold rush, which is when the first large number of Chinese immigrants come to the United States, most of them coming were men. In fact, most of the people going to California during the gold rush were men of all groups. And as there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment in the mines, there's also a lot of Latin American sentiment. And so, for example, Californians passed foreign miners laws that said that if you were not a US citizen, you had to pay a very high tax to have a mine. And so this was aimed at Chinese and people from Latin America. And this continued, this kind of anti-Chinese sentiment continued into, after the Civil War. And there was a sense that they were taking people's jobs, right? There are a lot of arguments that sound kind of familiar to anti-immigrant rhetoric today that were being used against the Chinese. So they're taking jobs. The idea, again, many of them were men who were sending money back home, and that was seen as strange, that they didn't have families. They were often kind of forced into jobs that were seen as unmanly, so laundry or cooking. And so there were lots of just negative stereotypes that come out of some of those conditions. There's also, China is a very weak country at the end of the empire under the Qing dynasty, and the European powers were basically dividing it up. So China as a country couldn't really defend itself. And again, the fact that it wasn't a Christian nation, all of those things combined to give white Americans a really negative set of stereotypes about the Chinese, that they decided that they couldn't become citizens of the US. They were just too different. And again, no other group is excluded from immigration in the same way at that time.
Thank you. As we know, China had a long history before Western missionaries arrived. Can you say anything about any organized resistance or pushback to the missionaries as they came into China?
Oh, that's interesting. So I know less about that as a US historian. I've read a little bit because I've kind of followed some of these women. But that, again, because Imperial China was at this point really pretty weak, there is resistance to the European nations that are coming in. Some of it is around missionaries, some of it is around the economic policies, right? This is the Opium Wars and the Boxer Rebellion. But many of these revolutionaries were actually connected to those Christian missions and were educated in European political thought. And so one of the things that they were trying to do was modernize China, and they saw, Republican forms of government and Christianity as positive things. They are a small group within, right, the bigger nation, and that's partly why there's lots of strife kind of after the revolution. But I don't pretend to be an expert on that.
All right, that's helpful. Any information about how the women you described were treated by husbands, male relatives, or friends as they fought for suffrage?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it sort of depended, but several of them had strong support from their male relatives. And I think that was really important. So Nina Otero-Warren, she and her cousin, the one who had been territorial governor, do not get along, but the other men in her family really supported her in her politics. And especially kind of her brother, who's also very part of the Republican Party, a very powerful part. And Mabel Pinghua Lee's father was very supportive of her getting an education, both a Western style education, right? She goes to Barnard, but he also was clearly teaching her the Chinese classics, kind of the traditional Chinese curriculum. And that was, right, that was very key. He clearly supported her for that. Two of the women I write about, though, got divorced, though they would have introduced themselves as being widows because being divorced was extremely scandalous. So Marie Bottineau Baldwin and Nina Otero-Warren both married white men and divorced fairly quickly. And you can see, though, they both hyphenated their names. So Nina Otero was her maiden name, and Warren was her married name. And that helped her, right, navigate both of those kind of social groups. And Marie Bottineau Baldwin, Bottineau was her father's name, like her maiden name, and Baldwin was her husband's name. And again, they both said that they were widowed because to be divorced was just extremely scandalous.
Thank you. Do we have any data which indicates the level of voting that takes place today among Indigenous people or has taken place over the years?
So it, again, until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then the amendments to that act in the 1970s, which especially stipulated that you had to have ballots in other languages and things like that. Voting participation was really low because, as I said, starting in the 20s, there was real efforts to disenfranchise Native people. The numbers started to rise after the 1970s. And right as you saw in the last election, in certain states, there was a lot of commentary about the Native vote, right? And you know, it wasn't always the same, right? So in North Carolina, it seems as though the Lumbee Nation went pretty solidly for the Republican candidate, for Donald Trump, whereas in like Arizona and Montana, the counties where there are reservations went strongly Democrat. So those voters do make a difference in the states that they're in, but they don't always vote the same way, right?
Okay. You talked about Curtis as an example of an Indigenous person becoming vice president. To what degree did complexion make a difference in terms of acceptance by white people?
Yeah, that's a great question. For Native people, it was a little bit about complexion, but it's also about, right, were they seen as quote unquote civilized or progressive? So how did they dress? How did they wear their hair? How did they talk? And this is the period, right, of the boarding schools where the federal government was taking Native children away from their families and putting them in boarding schools. And so comportment and behavior really mattered a bit more, I would say, than phenotype. But certainly the idea of if you were of mixed descent, like Marie Baldwin is French and Ojibwe, you were seen as more civilized. So it does matter, but there's a real romanticization of Native people at this time. So Edith Galt Wilson, who's Woodrow Wilson's second wife, claims and is very proud to claim that she's a descendant from Pocahontas, right? So that's a very different relationship than white people have to African Americans, say.
You may have addressed this earlier, but there's a question about distractions and how the women you described were able to maintain focus and not be distracted by things that were going on in the country or around the world.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it sort of depended on the moment in their life, right? So Marie Baldwin is incredibly busy for kind of those years around 1920. And as she gets older, it's harder for her. She gets tired and she can't do as much as she would like. And I see the same thing with some of the other women. So age matters. Only 2 of the women I write about had children. And so for Carrie Williams Clifford is one of them. And I see her activism really pick up once her kids are basically in high school. So yeah, absolutely. For these women, you know, whether or not they have jobs and, you know, family situations, all of those things certainly matter. World War I is a major disruption, and the suffrage movement as a whole has to decide, are they going to kind of set aside the fight for suffrage to focus on the war effort, which is what suffragists did during the Civil War? And Carrie Chapman Catt ultimately decides, no, we'll show that women can do both. So all of the women that I've talked about also get involved in the war movement. And so they're working kind of twice as hard during those years. So that's a really good, that's a very good question. Oops, I'm sorry, Will, I can't hear you, I think.
Phone was ringing, so I muted myself. Thank you. today, there's a lot of discussion about the efforts to disenfranchise African Americans in particular, led by state legislatures and the legislators in those states. Could you say something about federal authority regarding voting rights versus the authority of the states?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So the biggest thing that's changed in recent years, I mentioned the Voting Rights Act of 65 was huge. And that was the federal government saying, right, voting rights need to be protected. And through a variety of means. Again, sometimes it was about access to the ballot. Sometimes it was about, laws being state laws being considered unconstitutional. Because the 15th Amendment, which is the right to vote shall not be denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, and the 19th, which it shall not be denied on the basis of sex. And then there's another amendment that gets rid of the poll tax. But the Voting Rights Act brought federal power to these, right, backed up those rights. And in 2013, and the Supreme Court ruled in Shelby v. Holder that this major stipulation of the Voting Rights Act was no longer necessary, and the Supreme Court threw it out. And it was essentially said that the federal judicial department could look at state laws that had to do with voting. They had to be what was called pre-cleared. Before they could go into effect, the federal government looked at them and said, is this constitutional? Is this going to limit people's ability to vote? And if it didn't pass that test, it doesn't go into place. And there were many, many laws like this. And again, we think of like the former Confederacy in the South as the place that this was happening, but pre-clearance also applied to states like Arizona, Alaska, and South Dakota. And that was because they had traditionally disenfranchised Native people. Shelby v. Holder got rid of pre-clearance. So that's why since 2013, you have seen an enormous number of laws about voting rights and voting enter state right, and be discussed and voted on in state legislatures, because that federal sort of hurdle is no longer there. And the court, basically the majority of the court ruled that, those things were so long ago, they're no longer applicable, right? That was their ruling, was that's all in the past. We don't need to worry about this stuff anymore. It was ancient history, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, if I could be personal for a second, for me, this whole thing about voting rights has become very racialized. And I just wonder, is there a way to make it a societal issue? Do all white folks feel that they have not been hindered in their voting ability? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, so there's a great book by a woman named Carol Anderson called One Person, No Vote. And she shows how in the past, when there were laws that disenfranchised, especially African Americans, the rate of all people voting drops dramatically, right? These laws do keep people of color from voting, but they often affect everyone, right? And so voter participation drops precipitously to like really horribly low numbers. So the only a small group of people are voting and thus running things. And a lot of the laws now are being written as, quote, race neutral laws, but what you see is they're aimed at keeping mostly this particular population from voting. But that will affect everybody, right? Voter ID, lack of absentee ballots, a fewer number of polling places, that can certainly be targeted at particular populations in particular ways. But at the end of the day, it's going to affect everybody's ability to vote, and it is not healthy for our democracy.
I have to tell you, Kathleen, I wish I had the authority to contact CNN, MSNBC, so I could get you on the air, because what you just articulated, I don't hear about the overwhelming impact that this has on the society as a whole. We're almost out of time, but there's another question here about in 1952, when federal policy changed, barring Asian immigrants from becoming US citizens and having access to the vote. Could you talk about how that impacted Asian participation?
Yeah, absolutely. So that it's because China is our ally in World War II, the US changes those immigration laws. And so the exclusions and restrictions, and there's a law in 1943 and then 42 or 52 and then 65, the voting, the Immigration Act, the Hart-Celler Act of 1965 really changes US immigration policy and changes, right? So no longer are people kept from naturalizing. It also opens up immigration to many more. In 1924, Congress had passed a law that extended those exclusions, not just to the Chinese, but everybody from Asia. So from 1924 to 1960, well, into post-war period, everybody from Asia is banned, and it's not until 1965 that that's overturned. So that does change things dramatically. So 1965, yeah, is a really important year, Voting Rights Act and that Immigration Act.
As we run out of time, Kathleen, would you have any closing statement you'd like to make for our audience?
So I really am grateful for all these wonderful questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but yeah, you guys are a great audience. I really appreciate you listening to what I had to say, and thank you, Will, for coordinating those fantastic questions. And I hope that if I didn't answer the questions, maybe they will be in the book for you to find. So thank you very much.
I read your book and I recommend it highly. And it's not just because you're in front of me. Thank you very much. It was very informative. I hope everybody, I'm sure they did, got a lot out of it. Look forward to seeing you again. Take care.
All right. Thank you. Have a good one.
Kate?
Yes, for next week, our speaker is going to be Robin Rosen. She's a professor of women's studies from Marist College, and she was the humanities scholar for this project. And she is going to be focusing on what happened, especially in the decade after 1920. So please hop on for next week, and we look forward to having a great wrap up for our last session. And Will, thank you very, very much for your excellent moderation here.
Thank you, Kate. You know, I enjoyed it. You could tell.
I know.
Bye, everybody.
Okay,
Be
thank
well.
you.
All right.